سيدنا ونبينا محمد ختم الأنبياء وإمام الأصفياء وقدوة الأتقياء وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم آت نفوسنا تقواها وزكها أنت خير من زكاها أنت وليها ومولاها يا رب العالمين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وإخلاصا Ya Rabb al-Alameen. Alhamdulillah. As we continue to look at the chapter on Witr, after looking at length at the issue of the Sunnah Qunut and the optimal Qunut. So the Sunnah Qunut is a specific dua of Qunut. One can add the dua of Tawajjuh after that. One can add personal supplications after that. So there's a Sunnah Qunut and then there's an optimal Qunut. But then, what is the minimum qunut? So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَلَمْ يُحْسِنْ دُعَاءَ الْقُنُوتِ الْمُتَقَدِّمِ قال الفقيه أبو الليث رحمه الله تعالى يقول اللهم اغفر لي ويكررها 3 مرات. Whoever does not know, right, the dua al-qunut that we have looked at previously, al-faqih Abu Layth said, so Shurumulali is quoting al-Faqih Abu Layth, that this is typically not mentioned in the Mutun, right? Al-Faqih Abu Layth said, and this is accepted in the madhab, that they can say, يقول اللهم اغفر لي ويكرر, they can say, oh Allah forgive me, اللهم اغفر لي, repeating it 3 times. أو يقول ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Or you can say, O Lord, grant us in this life great good, and in the next life, great good, and protect us from the punishment of the fire. قال في التجنيس وهو اختيار مشايخنا, and this is the opinion chosen by our mashayikh. What is the tajnis? Sorry? التجنيس والمزيد is a work by Imam al-Marghinani, and it's significant. So التجنيس is المسائل المتجانسة. So التجنيس والمزيد has the issues that are similar to the issues that are transmitted in the madhab, والمزيد, and extra issues which are from the waqi'at and the issues of fatawa, etc. And it's a significant work for various reasons. Unlike many of the fatawa works, it gives legal reasoning, which is very valuable for that. And there's other works that do that as well. But also it is after the hidayah. So if al-Marghinani's opinion differs between the hidayah and the tajnis, the asl is that the opinion in the tajnis would be given precedence. So here, the qunut, the meaning of qunut is mutlaq ad-du'a. Qunut is any du'a, right? What Nur al-Idah says is that whoever does not know the previous du'a, they can say this, which would imply that if you know it, can you say it? Can you say these things? No. But this is not intended. So Tahtawi tells us here that even someone who knows the dua can recite these other things. So how we understand the qunut? Minimally, the qunut is mutlaqud dua, is any dua. It's a recommended sunnah to recite the dua al-qunut that the Hanafis have given precedence to. And it's optimal to say it with the additions that are mentioned previously. Right? And there are other transmitted things that one could add to it without making it excessively long, right? Now, minimally, it is any dua. So what al-Faqih Abu Layth mentions here, and this is what's one of the tricky things of the early scholars, right? That they're not concerned so, like very often their and this is true across the Islamic sciences, very often they are descriptive or prescriptive, not defining. Why? For the purpose of guidance. Right? Purely legally, you could say, okay, make any dua. Especially the earlier scholars, very often they'll give a descriptive and prescriptive thing. Say this or this. This is prescriptively. Is this the only thing you can say? No. They're just giving you a practice that if you're going to make any other dua and keep it brief, of the best things you can say is Allah maghfirli, oh Allah forgive me. Because of the meaning of maghfirah, that's so powerful. Or this dua, that's one of the most common du'as of the Prophet ﷺ, Rabbana atina fid dunya hasana, because it encompasses all good in this life. What is the good of this life? The good of this life is that which is pleasing to Allah, pursued in a manner that leads to the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the good of the next is ridwanun min Allah. It's the absolute good pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is just suggestive that these are things you can say. Any dua is now generally he doesn't reference his issues. The reason he mentions al-Faqih wal-Layth, because this is not generally found in most of the mutun, etc. in this way. Some of the later mutun added it, and it's neglected how much Ibn Abdin and some others took from those earlier mutun, right? But it's just sheer laziness of students of knowledge and many ulama, they're busy with other things, that they don't read, right? You have ulama who don't even have like Munyatul Musalli, let alone its commentaries, let alone having read them, or all these significant works in ibadat. It's just taqsir. Or the other things, like Khulasat al-Kaydani has many important commentaries, like by Sidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi and others. There's many important works just in ibadat. Well, they haven't read the larger works of fiqh. Nobody's issued a prohibition against reading after Hashit ibn Abdin to read the Fatawa al-Hindiyah, to read al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, to read al-Nahr al-Fa'iq, to read Fath al-Qadir, to read. Of course, with assuming you have the tools to read. So, أو يقول يا رب يا رب يا رب, or it says يا رب, right? Because where is the dua in it? It's implicit, because the essence of dua is إظهار الافتقار بين يدي العزيز الجبار, right? They say the essence of the meaning of dua is expressing one's absolute neediness before the noble, the overwhelming. Right? It's like say Ya Rab is like saying, you know what I need. Right? 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 And these are all suggestive. Right? Any dua would do. ذكره الصدر الشهيد فهذه ثلاثة أقوال مختارة. These are three chosen opinions of what you could say instead, but more broadly, any dua will do. Okay? Of the du'as permitted in the prayer, of course. There are three chosen, but these are not chosen in terms, this is the only thing you can do. Three chosen opinions, in terms of there being good things to say, and what would be most suitable to say. And each has a strong sunnah basis, right? وإذا اقتدى بمن يقنت في الفجر كشافعي قام معه في حال قنوته ساكتا في الأظهر. If one follows someone who does the qunut of Fajr, right? um, like such as the Shafi'i, one stands with them during their standing, and they do it after the ruku'. One remains standing. You say, okay, they'll catch up with me in sujood. I'm tired, I don't want to stand. No, you stand because you still do need to follow them and stay behind them. So you stand silently. What does silently mean? أي لا يؤمن. Right? One doesn't say Ameen. Fil Adhar. There's a more apparent position within the madhab. لوجوب متابعته في القيام, because it's wajib to follow them in the qiyam. لكن عندهما يقوم ساكتا. However, according to Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, one stands quietly, ساكتا, one doesn't say Ameen. وقال أبو يوسف يقرأه معه, أي يقرأ القنوت معه, meaning one recites the qunut with him, with the imam. لأنه تبع للإمام, because one is following the imam. والقنوت مجتهد فيه, and the qunut is a matter of ijtihad. فصار كتكبيرات العيدين, so it became like the takbirs of the two Eids. One follows the imam. If the imam says more than three, one follows the imam in it. والقنوت في الوتر فصار كتكبيرات العيدين والقنوت في الوتر بعد الركوع, and it's a matter of ijtihad, just as saying the qunut in witr after the ruku' rather than before. It's mujtahid fihi. It's mujtahid fihi, meaning is a matter that given the different texts is subject to ijtihad. So if the imam does it differently, follow them. That's the position of Imam Muhammad. So this is وَالْقُنُوتِ فِي الْفَجْرِ, this is with the kasra, right? So it's a atf. He gives two examples. So that the qunut itself is mujtahid fihi. Like, do you say it in fajr or not? It's subject to ijtihad. What's similar to it? This is all Abu Yusuf's position. Like the takbirs of the two Eids, and like the qunut of witr after ruku'. What's our madhab? Before ruku'. It's a matter of ijtihad because the texts have come in the other side. Though the Hanafis would say those texts refer to rafa'a ra'sahu, raise his head, meaning for the final rak'ah, not raise the head from the ruku'. But it's mujtahid fihi. It could be understood to the contrary. Right? So he mentions the position of Abu Yusuf to say there is leeway. However, he doesn't, because it's not meant to be a lengthy work. He's not choosing the position of Abu Yusuf, right? What is the adhar? Is the position of the imam, right? So one remains silent, that's the opinion. He gives the reasoning for the position of Abu Yusuf. Say it's not far-fetched. Some scholars did choose it. There's adhar, the other one is zahir. It has a wajh, there's a basis. However, Imam Tahtawi explains the argument of the Sahih of Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, which is the relied upon position. That the qunut of fajr is mansukh. The Prophet did it for a specific period and then he left it. So it's mansukh. That's the madhab. وَيُرْسِلُ يَدَيْهِ فِي جَنْبَيْهِ, and one keeps one's hands to one side in the qunut of fajr, meaning one doesn't tie it, because tying one's hands is a sunnah لِكُلِّ قِيَامٍ فِيهِ ذِكْرٌ مَسْنُونَ. Tying one's hands is a sunnah for any standing that has a sunnah dhikr. A sunnah dhikr meaning an emphasized sunnah dhikr. So the standing after ruku', is there an emphasized sunnah dhikr there? No. There's a dhikr that is good to say. Okay? right? Of the adhkar of rafa' min al-ruku', there's a whole bunch of them. That's not a dhikr masnoon. Dhikr masnoon means sunnatan mu'akkada. Or so one doesn't tie one's hands and one does not raise one's hands. The Shafi'is raise one's hands in dua al-qunut. The asl in our madhab is one doesn't raise one's hands. That's why he says لأنه ذكر لأنه what do you have? لأنه ذكر ليس مسنونا. Because this is a dhikr that's not masnoon. It's not a sunnah mu'akkada, but we don't consider it mashru'. That's not legislated. We respect the khilaf, so we stand with our hands to the side. We don't say ameen. Now you don't intend, oh Allah, reject this dua. You can make the dua with your heart. I would say, so you're missing out on saying ameen. Say, no, my Lord is more generous than that. Like what? If I don't say ameen, Allah won't give it to me? Give everyone else and leave me out? Like, you know. So anyways, and some of this goes back to the fact that Hanafis consider the prayer is, you know, the idea of the tahrima of the prayer. It's a delimited act. Anything extra, you got to prove that it's there. So say, okay, he did it for a month. Okay, that was exceptional. Exceptions remain exceptional. We don't generalize exceptions. That was the Prophet ﷺ, there's 23 years of risala. He did something for a month. He didn't do it before, he didn't do it after. How is that sunnah? Right? How is that sunnah? Janaza ala al-ghaib. He did it. Okay. That's not, the sunnah is not what the Prophet ﷺ did. Is the habit of what he did regularly. The mustahab is what he did regularly but not constantly. That's what's meant by fa'alahu marra wa tarakahu marra. He do it sometimes, leave it sometimes. Doesn't mean he did it once, left it once. That's not the mafhum of the sunnah in our madhab. The Prophet prayed over the Najashi. Okay. If we were there, we would have prayed with him too. Would you have walked out of the masjid that the Prophet prayed with the Najashi? No. So what does that prove? Right? Did he do it before the Najashi for anybody? Did he do it after the Najashi? Did any Sahaba die during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ? A few things happened. Just read the seerah. How many times was Salat al-Janaza ala al-Ghaib done? Hardly. So it's exceptional. So it's not sunnah in our method. Now if you want to be soft-headed and people are doing it, it's a different thing. You want to follow another madhab on it. Personally, what I used to do in Jordan, because all the time there'd be people killed by the Zionist forces in Palestine, and there'd be Salat al-Janaza al-Ghaib. I used to give the first takbir of Salat al-Janaza al-Ghaib without saying Allahu Akbar. And just make dua. But I wouldn't say the takbirs. I haven't done any of the integral Salat al-Janaza al-Ghaib. But if you want to follow it, Allah, it's the sunnah of Allah that there's 4 madhabs. If you follow another one on it, right? But anyways, وإذا نسي القنوت في ثالثة الوتر وتذكره في الركوع أو الرفع منه أي من الركوع لا يقنت. If one forgets the qunut in the final rak'ah of witr and one remembers it in the ruku' or after rising from the ruku', one does not perform the qunut because you missed the place. If you didn't recite in the standing, do you do it in the ruku'? If you didn't recite the Fatiha in the standing, do you do it after the ruku'? Do you do it in the sujood? No, you missed the place. It's gone. ولا في الركوع الذي تذكره فيه ولا بعد الرفع منه. Yeah? Not in the ruku' in which one remembered, nor after it. ويسجد للسهو, but one does forgetfulness prostrations. Why? Because one forgetfully left a wajib action. ولو قنت بعد رفع رأسه من الركوع لا يعيد الركوع. If one does the qunut after raising one head from the ruku', one did it in the wrong place, but one does not repeat the ruku'. ويسجد للسهو, and one performs forgetfulness prostrations. Why? Because you missed the ruku'. The qunut has a place, which is before the ruku' in the third rak'ah. So if you did it after raising your head from the ruku', because you delayed the wajib. ويسجد للسهو لزوال القنوت عن محله الأصلي, because you moved the qunut from its original place. وتأخير الواجب, and you delayed the wajib. ولو ركع الإمام قبل فراغ المقتدي من قراءة القنوت أو قبل شروعه فيه وخاف فوت الركعة مع الإمام تابع إمامه. If the imam goes into ruku' before the follower finishes reciting the qunut, or even before they started the qunut and they feared that they'll miss the ruku' with the imam, one follows the imam. So there's two scenarios. Reciting the qunut is wajib. So if you haven't recited the qunut, so there's two scenarios. Reciting the qunut is wajib. The optimal qunut was, what is its ruling? It's sunnah. So if you've made dua but you've not finished the qunut, then what's the ruling of following the imam without undue delay? It's wajib. And following the imam without undue delay is wajib. So إذا تعارض أمران, right? The general principle is, to simplify, is يترك الأدنى للأعلى. The lesser is left for the higher. Simple. The lesser is left for the higher. So you've done the wajib qunut, which is any dua. Say astaghfirullah once. That counts as qunut. Rabbi ighfirli. Okay? So if it all's left to finish the qunut, this is sunnah. You leave the sunnah for the wajib. So you follow the imam. If you haven't done any qunut, then now if two wajibs clash, the more sound opinion is that you do both if you can. But what fulfills the wajib of the qunut? Any dua. So you say astaghfirullah and go follow the imam. There is an opinion that you can leave the wajib completely. And that applies to the tashahhud and getting up. Right? Tashahhud is wajib in the first sitting, and following the imam without undue delay is also wajib. So what does one do? If you haven't finished the tashahhud and you don't have waswasa, you finish. The more correct opinion is you finish your tashahhud, then get up. But if you fear that the imam prays very, very fast, you're going to miss the rak'ah, then you could leave the tashahhud. Same thing here. لأن اشتغاله بذلك يفوت واجب المتابعة, because busying oneself with this would vitiate the wajib of following. Do you turn on the Omar? Do you turn on the cooling? وإن لم يخف فوت المشاركة في الركوع يقنت جمعا بين الواجبين. But if one does not fear missing catching the imam in the ruku', then one does the qunut to join between the two wajibs. But one does يعني ويأتي بأدنى قنوت. Right? One does the minimum qunut. Right? One doesn't have to say the whole thing because it's unlikely that the Imam will pray that long. ولو ترك الإمام القنوت يأتي به المؤتم إن أمكنه مشاركة الإمام في الركوع. Right? If the Imam does not perform the qunut, like you're praying witr behind someone of another madhab, they don't do it in the standing, the follower does it if they can catch the Imam the ruku'. Just say astaghfirullah with the intention of qunut before saying the takbir. That's valid. لجمعه بين الواجبين بحسب الإمكان, so that one joins between the two wajibs to the extent possible. وإن كان لا يمكنه المشاركة تابعه. If it's not possible for one to catch the Imam, like if you did the qunut, you couldn't catch the Imam the ruku', then one follows him. لأن المتابعة أولى, because following the Imam is superior. So, ولو أدرك الإمام في ركوع الثالثة من الوتر كان مدركا للقنوت أي حكما فلا يأتي به فيما سبق به. If one caught the Imam in the ruku' of the third rak'ah of the witr, one is effectively considered to have caught the qunut. Right? So one does not recite it in the rak'ahs that one has missed. And this has to do, what does the masbuq do? You can summarize in one principle. You caught what you caught and you're making up what you missed. So you caught the third rak'ah. You're making up what you missed. You're making up the first and second rak'ah. You caught the third rak'ah. You don't need to do qunut. That applies with respect to recitation as well, recitation of the Quran. It boils down to two principles that are mentioned in the Dur. We have an answer on what the latecomer does. They mention the issue. كما لو قنت المسبوق معه في الثالثة. Just as if the latecomer did the qunut with the Imam in the third rak'ah. You wouldn't do it in what you're making up. أجمعوا على أنه لا يقنت مرة أخرى. They agree. أجمعوا, when they mention إجماع in our books, what do they mean? أجمع علماؤنا. Because we're not discussing the other madhabs right now. So the asl is, they mention إجماع, meaning our scholars in our books, right? لأنه غير مشروع, because it's not legislated, meaning doing two qunuts in one prayer. وعن أبي الفضل تسويته بالشك. And Abu al-Fadl, right, on the early Hanafis, it's related from him that you could do it either way because of the shak, and there's leeway in this, right? According to him, the first opinion is the sound opinion. وَيُوتِرُ بِجَمَاعَةٍ إِسْتِحْبَابًا فِي رَمَضَانٍ فَقط. One does the witr in congregation, and this is recommended in Ramadan only. عليه إجماع المسلمين. يعني عليه, in the praiseworthiness of doing witr in congregation in Ramadan, there is consensus of the Muslims. لأنه نقل لأنه نفل من وجه وجماعة, and it's in Ramadan only. Why is it in Ramadan only? Because it is a nafl in one way. The witr is between the fard and the nafl. What does nafl mean? Yeah, nafl means ziyada. So is witr nafl? So, right? It's ziyada insofar as more than the fard. And the nafl is established by the Sunnah, so in that sense as well, it's from that. But the word nafl has multiple usages. والجماعة في النفل في غير التراويح مكروهة, and the jama'ah and congregational prayer for nafl, for other than tarawih, is disliked. فالاحتياط تركها في الوتر خارج رمضان, and the caution is to leave doing witr in congregation outside Ramadan. Now, the nafl jama'atan is makruh if two things happen. So he says, وَعَنْ شَمْسِ الْأَئِمَّةِ, right? أن هذا فيما إذا كان على سبيل التداعي. This is, the nafl is makruh if it's done in a manner that calls people to it. Right? So basically, they say, على سبيل التداعي, which is if you call people to it, or there's many people congregated. Right? أما لو اقتدى واحد بواحد أو اثنان بواحد لا يكره. But if one or two people pray behind one person, this is not makruh the nafl. They explain that what's established from the Prophet ﷺ for the nafl is that one or two people prayed behind him, right? In the famous hadith of Ibn Abbas, who was sent by his uncle to spy on the Prophet ﷺ. So he went to the house of Maymuna, his aunt, and he was lying down, but he wasn't asleep. When the Prophet ﷺ got up to pray, he joined, but he joined to the left of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ took him by his ear and brought him around. He did a reverse move, made him stand on the right. There's all kinds of lessons in the hadith related to the Prophet ﷺ, to nafl prayer, to correcting the follower, to the concern, to concern in learning from not just the teachings of, but from the example of a teacher. There's a permissible spying, right? Both with respect to Ibn Abbas, but also the one who sent him, al-Abbas. Also, there's lessons about the nafl. So what the Prophet did it. Say, yeah, but that's لم يكن على سبيل التداعي. Did the Sahaba congregate in the house of the Prophet? No. وإن اقتدى ثلاثة بواحد اختلف فيه. But what if there's three people? Right? And Al-Tahtawi says the relied upon position is that it's not makruh. Right? وإن اقتدى أربعة بواحد كره اتفاقا. But there's four, then this would be makruh. وصلاته أي الوتر مع الجماعة في رمضان أفضل من أدائه منفردا آخر الليل في اختيار قاضي خان. قال أي قاضي خان رحمة الله عليه هو الصحيح. Right? And this is different upon. There's two opinions in the madhab. Both have been chosen. But this one, that's why he quotes Qadi Khan. Because في اختيار قاضي خان points to the fact that others chose otherwise. Right? And his praying in congregation in Ramadan is superior to praying witr in congregation in Ramadan is superior to praying it on one's own at the end of the night, according to the choice of Qadi Khan. And partly because this is not explicitly affirmed in the madhab. Right? You don't have it in Zahir Riwayat. You see it in the Mutun? No. Right? So it does not appear to be explicitly there in Zahir Riwayat. This is why اختلف الاختيار. Others said otherwise, as he himself will tell us. And what's the reasoning for Qadi Khan? He said, this is the sound opinion, لأنه لما جازت الجماعة كانت أفضل. Because when congregation is permitted for it, then the congregation is superior. ولأن سيدنا عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه كان يأمهم في الوتر. And because Sayyidina Umar رضي الله تعالى عنهم used to lead the Sahaba in Witr. Right? Ubay رضي الله تعالى عنه would lead them, and others, but the main one appointed was Sayyidina Ubay, would lead them in Tarawih, and then Sayyidina Umar would lead them in Witr. And we've been commanded, عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين المهديين من بعدي. The Sunnah is established by the actions of the Sahaba, particularly the senior Sahaba, or what was widespread amongst the Sahaba, or was approved by the Sahaba. And this was done in congregation of the Sahaba. وصحح غيره, and other than Qadi Khan, أي غير Qadi Khan خلافه, chose other than this opinion. قال في النهاية, and in the Nihaya he mentions بعد حكاية هذا, after relating this, واختار علماؤنا أن يوتر في منزله, and our mashayikh, right, chose that he perform witr in his home. And sometimes these are ikhtilafat which are of historical relevance, that they are strands within the madhab. And it's of academic interest, that okay, where was the author of the Nihaya, Sharh al-Hidayah, from? And what is meant by our mashayikh would be the mashayikh of his region. He can find it. As-Sighnaqi, we mentioned earlier, right? Did we not? All right, same. Rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. That it's better to perform witr at home and not in congregation. لعدم اجتماع الصحابة على الوتر بجماعة في رمضان, because the Sahaba did not gather upon performing witr congregationally in Ramadan. لأن عمر رضي الله تعالى عنه كان يؤمهم فيه, وأبي بن كعب كان يؤمهم. Because Sayyidina Umar would get what? Okay, what do you have? There's something missing here. كان لأن عمر, can you read the expression, Umar? Okay, so we have a la missing, right? Right? Because the Sahaba did not gather for this, meaning did not agree on this. Sayyidina Umar would lead them in it, meaning sometimes, but Ubay would not lead them in it. And Ubay was of the fuqaha of the Sahaba. وفي الفتح والبرهان, in Fath, يعني Fath al-Qadir, and the Burhan, شرح مهائب الرحمن of الطرابلسي, ما يفيد أن قول القاضي خان أرجح. And what's in Fath al-Qadir and the Burhan indicates, يفيد, what's understood from it is the position of Qadi Khan is stronger. لأنه صلى الله عليه وسلم أوتر بهم فيه, because the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم performed witr with them in it, in Ramadan. And the hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. ثم بين عذر الترك, and he mentioned then the excuse for not doing it. وهو خشية أن يكتب علينا قيام رمضان. And the reason the Prophet left Tarawih in congregation and witr in congregation is the fact that out of his fear that it be deemed required for them. And the Prophet wanted ease for his ummah. لولا أن أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالسواك عند كل صلاة. That if I did not fear hardship for my ummah, I would have commanded them to use the siwak for each prayer. And many other lawla, all the things the Prophet, if not for such and such, right? sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. وكذا الخلفاء الراشدون صلوه بالجماعة. And likewise the Khulafa al-Rashidin did pray witr in jama'ah. So that's a stronger opinion, but both are validated. Both are validated. And the Nihaya is a major work in the Hanafi school. The Nihaya, Sharh al-Hidayah. And likewise, right, some of the other works, right? Right? Okay. ومن تأخر عن الجماعة فيه ومن تأخر عن الجماعة فيه أحب صلاته آخر الليل والجماعة إذ ذاك متعذرة فلا يدل على أن الأفضل ترك الجماعة أول الليل. right? ومن تأخر عن الجماعة فيه تأخر أي من الصحابة and those who تأخر does not mean delayed, right? Those who held back from. تأخر can be في الزمان, it can be with time, place or action. تأخر is to hold back. So تأخر can be, hold back means it can refer to delay on a time-based thing, but also تأخر عن العمل meaning he did not do it. So those companions who did not pray witr in congregation, أحب صلاته آخر الليل. They preferred to pray to pray the witr at the end of the night. Because there's a choice, right? Also because the Prophet ﷺ said to make witr at the end of the night. And one of the wisdoms is they wanted to stick to their habits. Because the merit in sticking to habits. وَالْجَمَاعَةِ إِذْ ذَاكَ مُتَعَذِّرَةً. And congregational prayer إِذْ ذَاك at that time, meaning آخر الليل, is not possible. يعني متعذرة meaning عادة, normally. فلا يدل على أن الأفضل فيه ترك الجماعة أول الليل. And this does not indicate that it will be better to leave congregation at the beginning of the night, which is typically when witr is done, when Taraweeh and witr are done. Isha comes in, you do Taraweeh, then you do witr. وإذا صلى الوتر قبل النوم. If one performs witr before sleep, ثم تهجد فلا يعيد الوتر. If one does the witr before sleeping, then does tahajjud, firstly, once you've done witr, there's no karaha whatsoever in any prayer after it whatsoever. Like you do witr, then you say, you know what? Let me pray istikhara as to whether I should marry Lubna. Is there any karaha? No, pray it. There's no karaha. They say, you know what? I need to do a whole bunch of prayers. I want to do Salat al-Shukr and Salat al-Haja. And I'm getting all these thoughts. Okay, pray. So I did my witr, doesn't matter. After witr, there's nothing wrong with any nafil after it. There's nothing wrong with, the nafil remains nafil, Salat al-Layl remains Salat al-Layl, Tahajjud remains Tahajjud in terms of hukm. And there's no two witrs in one night. So you did witr beginning of the night, you لا يعيد الوتر لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا وتران في ليلة. There's no two witrs in one night. And there's some interesting grammar related to that. You can read it in Tahtawi. Now witr, one of the important ahkam of witr right? From the important ahkam of witr is that given that witr is wajib, leaving the witr would be sinful. So in itself, the best time for witr is akhir al-layl, right? In itself, the best time for witr is the end of the night. Who is that for? لِمَنْ يَثِقُ بِالْإِنْتِبَاهِ. So anyone who is sure that they'll get up at the end of the night. So someone has an inveterate habit of tahajjud such that they'll invariably get up. Shaykh Khatib said even if someone misses tahajjud once every 2 weeks, do witr before you go to sleep. So someone has the inevitable habit of getting up for tahajjud. It just become their routine. Then you do it at the end of the night. If not, then you do it before you go to sleep. Why? Because you don't willfully do an action that will cause you to miss an obligation. So and there's fiqh related to that. If someone finds that doing it before sleep could cause them to forget or risk missing it, a lot of the ulama just say, and they'll just tell, most people, do they have a lot of himmah to do extra nawafil all day, etc.? To say, okay, when you do your isha, the fard of isha, the sunnah, the nafil, and do witr right there. Because while people are praying, just get it done. Because it's better to do something for sure than risk missing it. Oh, I'll do it just before I sleep. And do you normally pray at that time? No. When do you sleep? When I'm tired. If you're tired, you might miss it. So don't risk. So that's why the mashayikh, even though it's theoretically best to do it at the end of the night, a lot of places just teach people, generally, do your isha, your sunnah, your nafil, and your witr, and make that a habit. Because a lot of people have taqseer, have shortcomings with respect to their witr. Any questions before we go on to Bab al-Nawafil? Go ahead.
The dua that one could do after the dua, hudud, the wording he uses with like saying wa'afina, with tawallana, with like plural. When it comes to making dua, is it better to make dua, like always to make dua with like for us as a Muslims, or is it in certain circumstances to make better just for myself?
Both. Right? Is it better to make dua for oneself or for all the Muslims? Both should be done. Right? And that's why both modes have come in the Sunnah of the Prophet. Some du'as we don't necessarily, we say it as it's come. Rabbi ighfir li wa li waliday. That's the Quranic dua. We're going to say Rabbana ighfir lana wa li walidina. No, say it as it's come. Right? And it's come in both ways. Right? And what's the wisdom in it? Ibn Ata'illah has a number of hikam on the prayer. And they're amazing. Like, he covers all these kinds of aspects of the prayer. But amongst the wisdom of the legislation of the acts of worship, he says, تنوعت أجناس الأعمال لتنوع واردات الأحوال. تنوعت أجناس الأعمال. The types of devotional acts have been made variegated. لتنوع واردات الأحوال, because the variegated nature of the waridat, of the divine gifts that come in differing states. Because each type of spiritual work, but also each of the different types of prayer has its own divine warid, its divine gift. And different situations have different. So that's why one takes from all the things from the Sunnah. And what should one do in any particular situation? If there's a specific Sunnah regarding it, one gives precedence to that. The adab of mixing between what are the Sunnah adhkar and other adhkar, the ulama discuss this. Of two of the best discussions on it, number one is in Imam Ahmad Zarruq's sharh on Hizb al-Bahr. He goes into some of the things, especially because Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, attacked the practice of reciting awrad and ahzab and did a radd on the ahzab of Imam al-Shadili. So different people responded. Interestingly, Imam al-Shatibi had some objections to the practice of awrad and the practice of having a shaykh, etc. And a whole bunch of people responded to him, amongst them Ibn Abbad al-Rundi in his Rasail al-Sughra, and amongst them Ibn Khaldun in a book that's translated into English as well, which Allah Imam Zayd told me about in 97 in Damascus. Shifa al-Sa'il or something like that. It has amazing explanation of the need for a spiritual guide and when is a spiritual guide needed. And there's some very Ibn Khaldun's a brilliant man, rahimahullah. But and likewise in some of the commentaries on the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad, for example, there's several great commentaries on the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad. Many of them in their muqaddimah, they go into some of the adab of dua, etc. But the summary is that anytime there's a specific sunnah, one gives the specific sunnah precedence over other things. Like that's a broad principle, right? For example, after the prayer, what's the first thing one says? There's a specific sunnah there. So one gives precedence to that over other things. Right? Like there's specific sunnah, you don't even give precedence to another sunnah over there. Is it sunnah to say, Ya Hayyu Ya Qayyum bi rahmatika astaghith? Yeah, it's from the dua of the Prophet ﷺ. But when there's a specific sunnah, you give that's a specific to that place, you give precedence over that to other things. Once that is said, then you can engage in non-specific sunnahs, but then there's ikhtiyar, then you can say whatever you want. Because the asl in dua and dhikr is that it's mutlaq. As we know, in many, many things, the Sahaba transmit the dua of dhikr of the Prophet ﷺ and then made their own dua and dhikr. And there's much evidence for that. Right? And also there are there are a lot of adab related to dhikr and dua in the great commentaries on the ahzab. Some of the greatest ones are on the ahzab of Imam al-Shadili. The Hizb al-Bahr and Hizb al-Kabir have great commentaries on them, and the Wadhifa al-Shadiliya. Also the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad has some great commentaries on it. Likewise the Wird of Imam al-Nawawi, or also known as the Hizb of Imam al-Nawawi, which is an amazing dua, amazing dhikr, has a number of great commentaries on it. And often they have great great insights. So Hizb al-Bahr has the commentary of Imam Zarruq, also has a number of other commentaries, amongst them Imam Dawood al-Bakhili or Ibn Bakhillah. The Hizb al-Kabir has al-Fasi has a sharh on it. Al-Izmiri has a sharh on it, the great Hanafi. Al-Qawqaji has a sharh on one or the other. etc. They have many points of benefit. There's lots to read, folks. Okay. ثم قال رحمه الله تعالى. We can start a new lesson from here. ثم قال رحمه الله تعالى باب فصل في بيان النوافل. The نوافل. عبر بالنوافل دون السنن لأن النفل أعم. He used the expression نوافل rather than sunan because nafil is more general. إذ كل سنة نافلة ولا عكس, because every sunnah is a nafil and not the opposite. والنفل لغة الزيادة, because the nafil in the Arabic language is what is extra. وفي الشرع and in the sacred law فعل ما ليس بفرض ولا واجب ولا مسنون من العبادة. In the shara, it is to do that which is not fard nor wajib nor sunnah of ibadah. And this is problematic, right? This is problematic. Maulana al-Tahtawi explains that the nafil has two usages, right? One is that which is not fard or wajib is nafil. The other is that which someone does willingly without being commanded to. Right? So one usage, so there's multiple usages. Actually, there's more usages to the nafil. So nafil is what is extra. It's a simple way of understanding. That depends what you're talking about. You can say there's fard, everything else is extra to the fard. So it can encompass the wajib, sunnah mu'akkada, sunnah ghair mu'akkada, etc. Right? The nafl al-mu'ayyan and the nafl al-mutlaq. The nafl al-mu'ayyan, which is that which has a sabab or a waqt, right? Like things like duha, awabin, either connected to a time or a circumstance. Istikhara, shukr, tawbah, etc. Right? And the nafl al-mutlaq, you decide, I want to pray 2 rak'ahs for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you could say, okay, there's the fard prayer, the wajib prayer, and then you have nafil. And the nafil is extra. Right? Or you can say, there are fard, wajib, and sunnah prayers, and then there's nafil. So nafil can refer to what's extra beyond those. So it's a matter of usage. Right? If you appreciate that nafil is the extra. So you define something, and what's beyond it is nafil. Right? And that's why, in the hadith of wilaya, وما تقرب إلي عبدي بشيء أحب إلي مما افترضته عليه ولا يزال عبدي يتقرب إلي بالنوافل حتى أحبه. My servant draws close to me by nothing more beloved to me than what I made obligatory upon them, and my servant continues to draw close to me by the nawafil, by extra works until I love them. That encompasses everything that's not fard. It's a matter of usage. Don't tie yourself in knots, but know that there are these multiple usages. وَالسُّنَّةُ لُغَةً, I told us about the sunnah before, right? So the nawafil, some put the witr in bab al-nawafil. Sometimes it's called bab al-nawafil, it includes witr there. And now you should appreciate why. Sometimes they call it bab al-witri wa nawafil. But Imam Ashrun Bulali discussed the witr because it's wajib and because it contains the qunut, and he unpacked the qunut more than most texts do. So he put it in a separate chapter, and now he's discussing the nawafil. But now the nawafil, there are a few ways you can look at. You can look at them. There's sunnah mu'akkada, right? And which are the Sunnah Muakkada? They relate to the around the times of prayer. Like the Sunnah Muakkada prayers are around the Fard, correct? Is there any other Sunnah Muakkada prayer? Answer is no. So frequently the ulama refer, since the Sunnah Muakkada happens to be connected to the prayer, right? The Hanafis look at Bab al-Nawafil, and very often the Hanafis don't tell you the whole structure, but it helps to think of the structure. That the Nawafil relate, the Nawafil that are related to the prayer, and those not related to the obligatory prayers, and those that are not related to the obligatory prayers. Okay, so those related to the obligatory prayers, you have the Sunnah Muakkada, and then you have the Sunnah. They refer to it as Sunnah Ghair Muakkada. They don't emphasize Sunnah. Then those that are not related to the obligatory prayers are divided into those that relate to a specific time, those that relate to an occasion, and ما لها سبب, like istikhara, you want to make a choice, like need, like gratitude, etc. Tawbah. And then there are those that do not relate to time, that not relate to occasion, and this is what's called a naflul mutlaq, just an unconditional nafl. That gives a framework to understand the issue. Okay. So والسنة لغة تطلق على الطريقة مرضية أو غير مرضية. The Sunnah in the Arabic language refers to a way that is followed, whether pleasing or not pleasing. وفي الشريعة الطريقة المسلوكة في الدين من غير افتراض ولا وجوب. And the Shari'i meaning is a way that is followed in the religion without it being obligatory or sunnah. But we discussed the sunnah at length way back when we talked about tahara, right? Way back. Okay. وقال القاضي أبو زيد. Who's Abu Zayd? Any commentator put any, what do you have? No, just what's his last name? I can't believe that. Ad-Dabusi. Right? Abu Zayd Ad-Dabusi. Ad-Dabusi is very important. Ad-Dabusi wrote a great work in both Usul al-Fiqh and Fiqh called Al-Asrar. And there seems to be a pretty butchered, quote-unquote, critical edition. And the idafa is lidham. It's an addition to be critical of, not an addition that is critical, right? Anyways, it is what it is. He also wrote a work in Usul called Taqweem al-Adilla. It's one of the significant early works in Hanafi Usul. Great Hanafi jurist. Also wrote a brilliant short treatise called Ta'sis al-Nazar. I don't think any of the editors had a clue what he was talking about, because all the editions that I'm aware of the book totally butcher the book. Helps you become a little more intelligent, because we read it, alhamdulillah, with Sheikh Hassan. It was a nightmare, because literally every other line had major errors. Anyways, Abu Zayd al-Dabusi also has a brilliant work. So his Asrar is an important work, superseded of course by other works, but it's of significance. But he also has a book that is strangely neglected, but it's very important in our times, called Al-Amad al-Aqsa. Al-Amad al-Aqsa. It looks at the hikmat al-Tashri'ah, the wisdom of legislation. And there's a few of these books. There's another one called, and the Hanafis talked at length about this. It's something to be aware of. That while, as Hakim al-Ummah, rahimahullah says, in itself, the ulama said, submitting to Allah purely ubudiyatan is the most perfect state. And one shouldn't have to understand the wisdom of something to do it, but Allah Himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala, tells us the wisdoms of things. Right? And it encourages us, clarifies. So Al-Amad al-Aqsa is an important book. And likely from there, could be from some of his other writings. Of the great works in the Hikmat al-Tashri'ah, frequently the hadith commentators talk about that in their openings of chapters, etc. And very often it's a useful place. The Fuqaha, sometimes in the openings of chapters, give scattered things, especially people like Al-Kasani in the Bada'ir and others. Al-Mawsili in the Ikhtiyar, etc. And then of course there's someone who would have the right of objection, right? If Imam al-Laknawi, what's called Fakhrul Hind, would be Imam Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi. Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi, who some of the ulama would call Ghazaliul Hind, although a true Indian scholar said, like, that, they say that's being unjust to Shah Waliullah. Shah Waliullah was not only, Shah Waliullah was a great Sufi, was a great muhaddith, was a great hadith commentator, was a great theologian, was a great philosopher, had tremendous influence. He also wanted to be a mujtahid. He had ijtihadic tendencies. And he wanted to actually tread a different path from the four madhabs. He had a vision of the Prophet ﷺ with 4 fingers raised, to stay within the 4 madhabs. Then he had another vision in which he understood. It's a complex vision, but basically that there is a way that you can join between hadith and the Hanafi madhab without leaving the Hanafi madhab. Anyway, that's particular to him. So Shah Waliullah has some of his own idiosyncrasies that they're his. But very great Imam of the Deen. He wrote a work, nothing before it or after it is like it. It's called Hujjatullah al-Baligha, Allah's manifest proof. It's a brilliant work. And one of the remarkable scholars of recent times, Mufti Sa'id Ahmad Palanpuri, rahimahullah ta'ala, who just died a few months ago, he wrote a 5-volume commentary on it called Rahmatullah al-Wasi'ah, or Rahmatullah al-Wasi'ah. It's in Urdu. And it's really, really good. But anyways, so this issue of what is the wisdom of the Sunnah, right? Al-Amad al-Aqsa is a beautiful work. There's also an amazing work by Maulana Sayyidi Abdul Ghani Nabulsi called Asrar al-Sharia. And there's a PDF floating online. It's mediocre, but it's better than not having it, and it's beautiful. And it's got amazing things in Aqa'id as well. Well, sometimes Sheikh Abdul Ghani has some, like, if you find things in there, confirm them. But it's amazing. So I started when I was studying Sharh al-Tahawiyya with Sheikh Adib. I took an issue from it. I took another. So I made a habit every 2 or 3 lessons. I started preparing for it. I'd take questions. He gets so happy, right? Because he said, this is really beautiful, and he'd explain the principles. And it was it's a very beneficial book on the Asrar of the Sharia, but he looks at in aqa'id, in ibadah, in fiqh, but also in matters of tasawwuf, and he joins between the various acts. So these are some of the works on the Asrar of the Sharia. And Shah Waliullah also talks about the wisdom of the legislation of the Sunnah. Right? Ultimately, what is the Sunnah? Right? 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 Any? Right? It's a way that is followed. A way that's followed to what? Just a way that's followed, we just chill out on the way? Right? It's the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ad'u ila Allah. Right? Right? As one of the great Rifa'i poets said, طريقنا لله ما فيه غير الله عن أحمد الأواه أتى كعقد الدر. Our path is for Allah. There's nothing in it but Allah. From Ahmad, the penitent, it has come like a string of pearls. أتى كعقد الدر. طريقنا مبناه ما فيه غير الله. Right? The basis of this way, the way of the Prophet, is there's nothing in it but Allah. Okay? كان, why is he described as خلق عظيم? Imam al-Junayd said كان خلقه عظيما لأنه لم تكن له همة سوى ربه. He had no concern except his Lord. Right? And Shah Waliullah has amazing things about what is the wisdom of the legislation of the Sunnah. So he says, قال القاضي أبو زيد يعني الدبوسي رحمه الله تعالى النوافل شرعت لجبر نقصان تمكن في الفرض. That the nawafil have been legislated to make up for the deficiencies that creep in to the fard. And there's hadiths that point to that. Tahtawi mentions some. لأن العبد وإن علت رتبته لا يخلو عن تقصير. Because the servant, even if they're of the highest station, is not bereft of shortcomings. Particularly if you consider what does Allah deserve? وقال قاضي خان السنة قبل المكتوبة شرعت لقطع طمع الشيطان. The sunnah before the fard has been legislated to cut the keenness of the shaitan. فإنه يقول من لم يطعني في ترك ما لم يكتب عليه فكيف يطيعني في ترك ما كتب عليه. Because the shaitan will say, if you don't leave something that you didn't have to do, then how will you leave something that you have to do? And of course, these are just two of the sunnahs. Right? They're two of the aspects of the sunnah. There are others. All right. There also, the sunnah is لرفع الدرجات ونيل القربات. Right? And the hadith of wilaya is deserving of commentary. Right? But one of the amazing things of Sahih al-Bukhari, the hadith of wilaya, which begins the hadith Qudsi, من عاد لي وليا يعني آذنته بالحرب. Where is it in Sahih al-Bukhari? It begins talking about how the awliya are special to Allah, then talks about the fard and the sunnah. Which chapter is it in? The chapter is called Bab al-Tawadu, the chapter on humility. And it's very intriguing why Imam al-Bukhari would put the hadith on wilaya under humility. Either that to recognize the awliya of Allah, you have to have humility. Or to become of the awliya of Allah, you have to be humble. You have to be humble before your Lord. You have to be humble with Allah's creation. You have to be humble yourself before those who you could benefit from in order to attain the, what they have attained. And many other wisdoms. It's one of the subtle things in Sahih al-Bukhari. There are many scholars, including Shah Waliullah Dahlawi and others before him, and in the previous generation, Sheikh Zakaria al-Kandahlawi wrote a 6+ volume commentary just on the chapter headings of al-Bukhari, because the fiqh of al-Bukhari is in its chapter headings. Anyways, then he says, وَالسُّنَّةُ مَنْدُوبَةٌ وَمُؤَكَّدَةٌ. The sunnah is recommended or emphasized. وَبَيَّنَ الْمُؤَكَّدَةَ بِقَوْلِهِ. And he mentions the emphasized by saying, right, and we'll look at this Sunan al-Mu'akkada bi'idhnillah. Next, we'll start from here next class. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay.